Hi everyone, Mr. Hauger here. We haven't had a proper chapter test for a bit, so I decided a video podcast review would be helpful for Unit 5, which we've been studying, which is successes and struggles in a post-slavery society. I'm going to run through some of the answers, and if you weren't in class, should help review topics, help you prepare some notes that you can bring in, and just refresh you on the discussions we've had over the last 3 weeks. I hope you're doing really, really well. Okay, so we start off talking about what was it that forced separation of white Americans and African Americans and black Americans in public places. And we're talking about black codes. We're talking about segregation as well. The answer, because sometimes both answers seem correct, would be segregation. Black codes were laws, and they were definitely restricting equality, access to the rights that everyone has. But segregation is forcing people to separate. So when you're answering questions, think about the definition. Not just, yes, we've talked about all four of the possible answers in class, but which one is defined in the term and the context. So forced separation is segregation. The laws that enforced and back that up. Then you're talking about, think about the laws and the enforcement. Then you want to choose Jim Crow, because that's the whole era of the laws and the codes that are available to prohibit people from using the same entrances and fountains and bus seats and all of the strives for equality that were happening and struggles and inequalities that were happening during the time. In 1883, who ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional? When Reconstruction is falling apart, what is the agency that rules that? And the key is to think about government class. Who rules laws unconstitutional or constitutional? Who rules? Juries rule. The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court being the deciding body to interpret the law of the United States. So the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional in 1883 and struck it down. And that would, of course, symbol decades of backward steps and progress going the opposite direction that had been happening during Reconstruction. The court ruling in 1896 that upheld separate but equal laws. So now we're again 13 years forward, and the Supreme Court has a chance to rule constitutional, unconstitutional. And in the case that separated people for much longer, you want to think about the case that we talked about in class, Plessy versus Furguson. And we talked about Homer Plessy trying to get arrested and then to rule Louisiana law is unconstitutional, and it didn't work. The Supreme Court upheld separate but equal instead of striking it down. For less expensive labor and to solve issues with machinery, now think about industrialization, moving into the 20th century, textile factories and coal mines employed child labor, and we talked about that extensively because kids could fit in smaller places. Oops. So that's something we talked about. We looked at photographs in class and historical documents of coal miners. The Supreme Court said that the 14th Amendment did not apply to states. Was U.S. versus what in 1876? Again, this is a case that we looked at, and you might not be really ready for that question because maybe you didn't take specific notes or you were outside class. Cruikshank versus United States, 1876. And the reason I throw in that specific case is that it said states could do what they want in denying the 14th Amendment. And that, again, is going to turn states towards giving them permission to not enforce equality and equity and progress and racial equality. So Cruikshank versus U.S. is another setback in 1876. What were Redeemers trying to achieve? They were trying to eliminate government involvement to aid freedmen and keep life with the old establishment in power. Moving along, we're about halfway through the multiple choice at this point. What was the name for Northerners who moved south to take advantage of the weak Southern economy? We talked about what does it mean to go and grab things in other territories and to bag them and to add to your portfolio through purchasing resources that are struggled or damaged, carpetbaggers. And the Southerners who voted for Republicans are called scalawags. The president that pulled the military out of the South and ended Reconstruction altogether as a result. Who was the president that was involved in that? We talked about how there was a very close election and a president decided to appease the South by ending Reconstruction. That's Rutherford B. Hayes. And we talked about that pretty extensively in class. Then by the turn of the century, we focused on changing in pop culture, cities and architecture, and the growing urban sprawl, and how by the turn of the 20th century to the 21st, we had 40% of Americans living in city. By the turn of the 21st, it was 80%. Keep those two numbers separate. 1900, which is the turn of the 20th century, 40%. The turn of the 21st century into the year 2000, 80%. To use limited space, we start building skyscrapers, and iron and steel start becoming incredibly important to those dwellings. If you lived in a high-rise and you were in an urban setting with a small studio space and you were in a building that maybe was dilapidated or run down, you were in what was called a tenement housing. Governor Holden is the first politician in America impeached and removed from office. That's one I definitely felt like a podcast was helpful because we brushed by that very quickly. Governor Holden was removed from office, the first politician charged with the crime, had a trial, removed from office. Moving along, in 1895, this writer spoke to 800,000 visitors about how to address the African American community economically. Think economic concepts, think economic speakers, and think Booker T. Washington, who motivated African Americans to get rights through participating in the economy and being able to upwardly mobilize and then get rights and respect and equality that way. Schools in the southern states were racially segregated, and white schools often received more funding. We spent a whole day talking about that and the differences. In 1890, only about 1% of African Americans attended high school. And discrimination in the late 1800s in the North often came in the form of segregated communities and lower-paying jobs. After that, we've just got a handful of open-ended questions. Who is Sidney Poitier? Why is he significant to African American history? And we watched the movie In the Heat of the Night. I hope you were able to be in class for that. If you weren't, it would be worth, just for your own enjoyment and knowledge of film and actors and entertainment, American history, go to Amazon and rent it. I think it's $1.99 if you can do it. It's a wonderful film, 1967. First Black Academy Award winner for Best Actor. And then there wasn't another till 2002 with Denzel Washington. Excellent film. We also appreciated, I think, the concepts of the movie and how he was able to portray positive figures in a time where that was rarely done, in fact, impossible before him. I need you to know the three industries that grew from 1870 to 1820 and who employed child labor. It should be in your notes. You can also look that up ahead of the test if you'd like. What was the biggest step forward for African Americans? The next question being, what was the biggest struggle or setback? In the multiple choice, if you're clever, you can look back and find 3 or 4 Supreme Court cases in the questions. That's also a good student study skill to be able to draw an answer from a question. And then to analyze the photo that we looked at in class about World War I. I'm not going to tip you off to that. I don't want to spoon feed you everything, but I did give you quite a head start here. And I hope that that's helpful as you prepare and you study. In class going forward, we'll be looking at World War I and the impacts and aftermath. We'll then talk about the road leading to World War II. We'll talk about segregation in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And then when we get into the 50s and 60s, we'll be studying the text Warriors Don't Cry, the memoir written by Melba Beals, my former teacher from Dominican University. And we're going to read it. And I'm excited for that unit and what we'll learn from it and hear her thoughts directly. She's still with us. She's still alive, but is getting into an advanced age and can't get out to speak too much, or we'd invite her into the physical room here. All right. Well, good luck on the test. Review your notes. You now know all of the multiple choice questions and the free response. Make sure you've got some notes prepared for that and review what you have. And hopefully this has been helpful. We'll see you back in class. Bye, everybody. And thanks very much. Thanks for being great students all year. See you soon.